Stay woke, fam. These words have become a regular part of the modern political conversation. While today, some of the topics are deemed politically controversial, looking back through history, it's easy to see who was right and who was wrong. What social movements were being campaigned for? Were they successful? What can we learn from their victories? Learn all about the woke movements of the 19th century. While the most modern usage of the word woke can be traced back to the 2016 Black Lives Matter movement, its origins go back much further, and the ideas behind its meaning can be traced back centuries. Today, we'll be going over some of the largest woke movements from US history from the 19th century and see just how their successes have shaped the world we live in today. If you're interested in early access to more videos like this and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss anything intriguing. Today, much of what is considered woke is what people would have called politically correct in the 1990s. That is to say, anything that tends to be aware of social injustices and institutional biases. This is indeed at the heart of wokeness, going back at least 200 years. The exact nature of what systems or prejudices exist has changed considerably since then. The first recorded use of the word in regard to social change can be traced back to a 1943 article from The Atlantic discussing the state of mine workers at the time. The article quotes a Black United Mine Workers official from 1940. "Waking up is a damn sight harder than going to sleep, but we'll stay woke up longer." Here, the unnamed source seems to be using the idea of being woke as a synonym for social institutional change. While it might not be clear from the quote itself, the context surrounding it highlights this fact. At the time, segregation of the labor market in the US was the norm, and the southern states had been hit especially hard by violent labor riots aimed at keeping Black Americans from accessing certain jobs. But the idea of being awake as being a stand-in for being socially aware can be traced back even further. In 1860, the United States was facing a presidential election that would shape the entire nation for decades to come. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for several nominees to fight it out for the elected office, and in the run-up to the election, 4 candidates stood out. One of the younger, more ambitious candidates was the nominee from the, at the time, 6-year-old Republican Party, a man named Abraham Lincoln. To help propel themselves to victory, the Republicans of the day found support from a new generation of voters who helped push Lincoln to victory. These young men, yes, all men, women couldn't vote, yet, were known as the Wide Awakes because of their youth, enthusiasm, and torch-lit nighttime marches. William H. Seward, governor of New York and future Secretary of State, famously said of these youngsters during Lincoln's campaign, "Now the old men are folding their arms and going to sleep, and the young men are wide awake." Much like the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s and the Black Lives Matter movement of the 2020s, this early push for equality was met with fierce opposition. Many wealthy Southerners felt threatened by those who stood against slavery and the money it brought in. Ballots for Lincoln wouldn't even be distributed in 10 southern states, as many feared the military-style wide-awake movement was readying an invasion. There were even anti-wide-awake factions, like the chloroformers, who would put the wide-awakes to sleep. As we know, Lincoln would go on to win the election and become America's 16th president. The timing couldn't have been more important, because America's #1 social injustice was about to be violently undone. Sadly, it's impossible to discuss America in the 19th century without talking about slavery. The slave trade had been running rampant for centuries, and unfortunately, but undeniably, built what had become the United States. However, an increasing number of people had come to realize that this was, well, barbaric, inhumane, and unjustifiable. Things needed to change. However, the moneyed powers that be were, unsurprisingly, unwilling to part with the status quo that so benefited them. The Abolitionist Movement was formed to end or abolish slavery in all its forms. The foundations of the movement were a deep sense of empathy and a commitment to anti-racism and anti-slavery activism, challenging the status quo and advocating for social justice and equality. One of the most powerful tools used by the Abolitionist Movement was literature aimed at raising awareness about the evils of slavery. Many Northerners were simply too far removed from the realities. In a pre-mass media America, getting the word out about what was happening was crucial. One of the most important literary figures of this time was Frederick Douglass, a former slave who gained freedom and went on to write several books on his experience while traveling the country, speaking against the evils of slavery. In his famous 1852 speech, Douglass challenged the hypocrisy of celebrating American freedom and independence while slavery still existed in the country. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? To him, Your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. Of course, words alone wouldn't be enough to change the entire economic system of a country. The Abolitionist Movement made heavy use of direct action and civil disobedience to force the changes they wanted to see in the world. Easily the most famous of these actions was the now legendary Underground Railroad, a network of safe houses and secret routes used to help enslaved individuals escape to freedom. One of the most prominent figures of this movement was Harriet Tubman, who routinely risked her own life in furtherance of the cause. Like Douglas, Tubman was a former slave and made countless trips on the Underground Railroad to help others escape. Tubman would later go on to work as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War. In fact, in 1863, she became the first woman to lead an armed assault during the war, guiding Union troops along the Combahee River in South Carolina to free more than 700 slaves. Eventually, the fight over abolition would lead to the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict the U.S. has ever fought. But, in the end, justice did prevail, and slavery was formally abolished in the United States on December 6, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified. 19th century America wasn't particularly kind to women either. In many states, women couldn't open a bank account, own property, or hold many types of jobs. At the national level, women were also not allowed to vote. The National Woman Suffrage Association was founded in 1869 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton with the goal of securing voting rights for women across the country. The same year they were founded, the association was key in passing legislation in Wyoming, the first state that allowed women to vote. In 1893, they also helped mobilize and register women voters in Colorado, which became the first state to allow for women's suffrage as a result of a public election. The ideas behind suffrage went beyond voting. It was founded in ideas of gender equality and women's rights and sought to challenge traditional gender roles that had limited women's opportunities for centuries. Suffragettes organized protests, rallies, and marches nationwide to raise awareness of their cause and pressure lawmakers to pass women's suffrage legislation. However, the movement faced significant opposition, with some people arguing that women were not capable of participating in the political process, while others believed that granting women the right to vote would upset the social order. Despite these challenges, the suffrage movement eventually achieved success. The 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed in 1920, granting women the right to vote. This was a major milestone in the struggle for gender equality and paved the way for further advancements in women's rights in the 20th century. Times were even tough for white men in much of America at the time. The idea of labor laws, workplace safety, and work-life balance simply did not exist. The Industrial Revolution had led to an explosion in productivity, but the conditions of 19th century factory work were deplorable. During the labor rights movement, workers were encouraged to come together to demand better treatment and to support each other in their efforts to improve their lives. The labor movement sought to change the idea that workers were disposable commodities and argued that they deserved respect and dignity in the workplace. Overall, they aimed to improve the lives of workers by advocating for better wages, shorter workdays, and safer working conditions. Eugene V. Debs, the founder of the American Railway Union, inspired millions of workers. As head of America's largest labor union, Debs was the leader behind the infamous Pullman strike of 1894. During the strike, workers protested wage cuts and unfair labor practices by the Pullman Palace Car Company. The strike eventually involved more than 250,000 workers and brought rail traffic across the country to a standstill. In response to the protests, President Cleveland ordered federal troops to intervene and break up the strike, resulting in violence and arrests of union leaders. This heavy-handed approach demonstrated the government's alignment with corporate interests and their disregard for workers' rights. The government's response to the Pullman strike only further highlighted the need for fair labor laws and protections for workers. However, the labor movement persisted, and its efforts ultimately led to significant improvements in working conditions and labor laws that protect workers' rights to this day, including a federal minimum wage, the 8-hour workday, the idea of weekends, and basic workplace safety precautions. While problems of racism, gender inequality, and labor abuses are still rampant in America in the 21st century, it is important not to lose sight of just how we have come as a culture. As Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.